So in the previous video, we learned that the slope for any given graph is simply the change in y over the change in x. And this slope, this is called m. The letter m denotes the slope, and the slope is also called the gradient. Now, so slope is the change in y over the change in x, and the slope for any given graph tells us how steep the graph is and whether it's increasing from left to right or whether it's decreasing from left to right. So for something like y is equals to 2x, when we have a positive slope, it will be increasing from left to right, whereas the value or the magnitude or the size of the number is telling us how steep the graph is. Now, we know for linear equation, the slope is always a constant for any two given points. If I take any 2 points on this line and I measure the change in y and divide by the change in x, I should get a constant slope of 2 in this particular example. So now let's look at a calculation. For example, so let's say I start with this point over here. Let's call this point A, and I end up at this point B. Now the change from A to B. So now first we should understand that any point can be represented by the notation x comma y, where this is the x coordinate and this is the y coordinate. So the point A has the x coordinate, the value of x is -2, whereas the y coordinate for A is -4. So the coordinates of A are -2, -4, whereas the coordinates of B are +1, 2. So the coordinates of B are 1, 2. So now, if I wanted to calculate the slope of this graph, let's say I go from A to B. If I went from A to B, my slope would simply be the change in y over the change in x. Now the change in y from A to B, the change in y is the difference between the y coordinate of B and the y coordinate of A. So for example, over here, y has changed by +6. We've moved up by 6 units. So the change in y is the end point, which is +2, and the difference from the starting point. So the difference between the end point and the starting point, so the end point being B and the start point being A, the difference in y values, or the change in y, is +6, whereas the change in x is 1 minus 2. So when I do this calculation, when I do the math over here, I get a value of m is equals to 6 over 3, which is equals to 2. So that's one way of looking at or calculating the gradient for a given graph, or the slope for a given graph. Now, what if I had started at B instead of A? So what if I went from B to A? Well, my value of the slope shouldn't change. The value of the slope shouldn't change. I can take any two values. I can choose A or B as the starting point. It doesn't matter. So if I took B as the starting point, let's say, so in the second example, if we take B as the starting point, over here, we realize that we start our difference between the end point and the starting point. So we end at -4 for y, but we start at +2. So the change in y is -4, -2. Whereas the change in x is -2, -1. So my starting point is 2, my end point is -4. So my change from B to A, my change in y is -6, whereas my change in x is -3. I moved from right to left and I moved downwards. So my slope comes out to -6 over -3, which is again equal to 2. So it doesn't matter whether I choose A as a start point or B as a start point. My slope will always come out to the same value. If I take any 2 points on this line, it doesn't matter where I start, it doesn't matter where I end, any 2 points on this line, if I measure the change in y over the change in x, it should always give me a constant value, where that value will be equal to the slope. So more generally, if I took, for example, A as my starting point here, I can say that A is simply x1, y1. And B, which is my endpoint, is simply x2, y2. And if I know that the slope is simply the change in y over the change in x, I know that y, the difference between the values of y is y2 minus y1, whereas the difference between the values of x is x2 minus x1. So this is probably an equation that you guys are familiar with from your previous years, that the slope is simply y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1.